Welcome to the third event in the recovery stream of the 2020 WHO Healthy Working Lives seminar series, focusing on the Compare project. There'll be another 3 free seminars between now and June. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today. My name is Dr. Michael Di Donato from the Healthy Working Lives Research Group at Monash University, and I'll be your MC for today's event, the critical role of insurance case managers in return to work. In today's seminar, we have Associate Professor Ross Iles, Deputy Director of the Healthy Working Lives Research Group, and Matthew Bannan, Head of Stakeholder Engagement at WorkCover Queensland. Prior to joining the Healthy Working Lives Research Group at Monash University, Ross taught physiotherapy and research skills to university students for over 10 years. Ross's particular research interests focus on methods of identifying individuals at risk of prolonged work disability, and he has led projects in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, related to the development and implementation of methods to enable early and appropriate intervention. He was also part of the team who developed education for physiotherapists to manage clients injured at work or on the road in Victoria and South Australia. Matthew has been at WorkCover Queensland since 2007. He commenced his WorkCover journey as a physiotherapy advisor. He currently leads the Stakeholder Engagement portfolio, which has a collective purpose to create trusted stakeholder engagement through positive interactions and building relationships. There'll be a Q&A at the end of this session, but throughout the seminar, you can submit questions via the Ask a Question button below your live stream. I will now hand over to Ross.
Thank you very much, Michael. So today's presentation is all about the critical role of insurance case managers in return to work. And the way that we're looking to present today's session is to provide a little bit of research, and then also there's a little bit of, I guess, the real life issues behind actually looking to change case management practice and to try and incorporate some of that research and actually get it into practice on the ground. So it's important to highlight the importance of the claims experience. We know that workers can actually find engaging with workers' compensation to be quite stressful, and when it is identified as stressful, it actually contributes to poorer outcomes for those workers. And when we summarise the research in this area, there's nearly a third of claimants with traumatic injury reported that some administrative claims processes were actually really quite stressful, and that can include things like delays in decision making, really strict or rigid processes, and things like poor communication can really impede return to work for some people. And these the current events that we're holding focus on the Compare study, and one of the arms of the Compare study really identified a strong and significant association between the experience of the insurance claims process and people's return to work status. And the things that were found to be really quite important there were related to injury type, the jurisdiction of claim. So where you actually have your workers' compensation claim can actually have an impact on your experience. And then the time that it takes to lodge the claim were the things that were most strongly associated with claims experience. So that's a very a quick outline of some of the research. We can also look to the cross-sector report, which was a piece of research commissioned by the Collaborative Partnership for Work Participation, where we compared and contrasted, if you like, 10 systems of income support across Australia. So that includes workers' compensation. And of course, there were some similarities and some differences across those different systems. But there was one factor that was in common across all those systems, and that they all provide some level or some type of case management. And so the result of that is that there's often a focus on case managers when it comes to the experience of workers' compensation. And that case manager is often the person that has direct contact with the injured worker. And as we know, their experience of the system can be quite closely tied to how they interact with that case manager. But if we think about the state of the science in terms of what some of the research tells us, is we can identify what skills are available from case managers And in terms of this diagram, what we can do, we can actually summarize the research almost like an inverted pyramid. And when this triangle is focused on predictive factors, and predictive factors can be used to help case managers identify what is the best way to respond to an injured worker's particular situation to provide them the best rehabilitation and recovery possible. At the top of there's research that explores what factors might be able to be used to predict who might be at risk, and then developing that into models to actually identify, what are the best ways to identify people. And then as the wedge gets thinner, we start to validate those models. And then right down the bottom of that wedge, there aren't very many studies that actually show like a confirmation of impact of actually doing that and actually putting it into practice. So information about how you change case manager practice to align with the research is actually very thin on the ground. And the aim of today's seminar is to focus on the real world learnings of introducing a new model of case management, the recovery blueprint, introduced by WorkCover Queensland. So I'll give you a very quick overview of what that means from a research perspective. And in a moment, Matthew will give you an outline of what it means from WorkCover Queensland's perspective of what that recovery blueprint model looked like. But as a very high level, there were 3 phases to recovery blueprint. The first phase involved triage, which was based on the information that's available when a claim's accepted, and that identified or it allocated workers to a care profile that was based on the expected duration of their recovery based on the type of injury that they had. We know some injuries can be expected to recover quite quickly. Some injuries, just by their nature, will take longer to reach recovery. And then if there are any factors that mean someone's at a higher risk of actually going beyond the expected timeframes for that particular injury. And that can be things like their age, the nature of the industry that they work in. And then you can identify, based on that care profile, what's the best level of support to provide them in terms of the different case managers available within WorkCover Queensland. Phase 2 was almost like an information gathering stage where the case manager identified risks based on their interactions with stakeholders. So after conversations with the worker or conversations with the employer, and they had a range of questions they needed to answer based on that information to identify whether a risk was present on a claim or not. And that step was then followed by a standardised information gathering step. The most commonly that was by sending a questionnaire to the injured worker that they might be able to, that they would complete, and then that would give the case manager some more information. If it was a discussion with the employer, it was like a staged checklist that the case manager needed to follow to collect the appropriate information. So that phase 2 was really about information gathering. And then phase 3 was then turning that information that was gathered into some care delivery recommendations. So actually suggesting to the case manager what appropriate steps might be worth taking based on that information that was collected on claim. And in terms of where the research is involved in this process, at each step, the research informed which category that someone should be in or the level of support they needed, or what types of questionnaires might be useful, what sort of risks should we be looking to identify, and then putting in a stepped care approach to identify what are the first line recommendations and what should be saved for later down the track. So there's evidence sitting behind the design of Recovery Blueprint the whole way. But what's really important, and I'm looking forward to Matthew providing some insights is to how did those things play out in practice for WorkCover Queensland managing 60,000 claims thereabouts every year. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Matthew. Michael's already done an introduction. There's some more information there for you, but really looking forward to having a chat with Matthew about the WorkCover Queensland experience of looking to introduce evidence-based risk identification to how they manage their claims.
Thanks, Ross, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity today to come and discuss our experience with our Recovery Blueprint pilot. First of all, WorkCover would just like to acknowledge and pay respects to Queensland Elders past, present and emerging. Today I come to you from the Yagara and Turrbal people's lands. We thank the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia for their ongoing custodianship of land, waters and community. So it's really good to follow Ross in terms of having worked together on this as an organisation with Monash and the team to actually talk you through what became of Recovery Blueprint. So we now have adopted this as what it's called our tailored care and support approach to claims management. So it utilises the setup and the system and the information we embedded as part of Recovery Blueprint, but now it's involved across all our claims teams. And as Ross alluded to, we have about 65,000 claims a year accepted claims that come through this portfolio. So what I'll try and do in the short time I've got is just talk you through what the approach is, how it works, and then just quickly some of the learnings that we took from that might help you externally understand some of the challenges or some of the opportunities when you do this. As you can see there, we have our claims fit into 3 phases. For those in the workers' comp sphere will know there's obviously a claim lodgement phase. And this is an opportunity where we gather information either from the customer directly, utilising some of the data in the back end and some of the technology to actually help us understand what the risk or claim profile, as Ross alluded to. So at that point in time when we make a decision on the claim profile is allocated and it's based on the risk of recovery and return to work. And the way we've turned it into is sort of a 2-phase approach. So we know that there are people that need less support and they're at lower risk of long durations. And we base that on a low and high risk category. So in the bottom group there, you'll see guided and independent. So these are the groups of people who have a lower risk, but maybe a short or a longer duration. And these people, we don't actively case manage. They have claim owners and they have people that are available, but we get out of the way. We check in when they need it, we offer assistance, but we don't actively case manage this group based on the risk that's in front of us. The ones that we do actively case manage are called our managed claims, and they're in 2 structures here. We call it supported and involved. Now, again, this focuses on both high-risk claims, supported being a short duration and involved being the long duration. You'll see there's a 5th category there for specialised. What we don't do with some of our more catastrophic injuries, spinal cord burns, amputations, is we address them in a specialised team. So we provide that different level of care. They're a smaller group, thankfully, but we approach them slightly differently. But the principles of risk would assume that they're higher risk, so we have appropriate have specialised teams to deal with that. The way this works for us is that this is a system-enabled, system-supported, but not system-driven. It's actually still human-driven. So all of these claims have a person connected to it. And we have humans there for the very reason that decisions and interactions need to happen. So, for example, in the guided independent group, if it doesn't quite match up, the human can make a decision to override the risk profile and bring them into the managed claim group to address maybe something that's changed during the course of the claim. In our involved and supported group, we have a lot of different tools that were built into the system to assist our customer advisors, as we call, or case managers, to do their work. And this really utilises the information we already have from the care profile. But our system enables them to work through a series of profile questions which can flag the risk even further, and then informed by further questions in relation to maybe the worker's coping, the employer's support for return to work, maybe the injury severity. And then they can utilise the injury questionnaires or the patient-reported outcome measures, as you would more commonly know them, to send them out electronically to workers to further understand if there's a change in risk or if it's matching up. And through that, then we structured some care conversations that are built in to help drive some of those important conversations at various stages during the life of the claim. The 3rd phase of that, obviously, is then making those recommendations on what's needed around, or care recommendations, as Ross alluded to, that stepped care approach. And this is about identifying, given the risk or the profile or the things we're seeing in front of us, what sort of recommendations should we do? Should we engage with the providers and the employer to make sure we can support the person's recovery and return to work? And hopefully, if we get this all right, people have a great outcome and they return to life and function and move back to their normal life. You'll see down the bottom right for us, our scheme is a little bit different. We have short tail and we have a common law part of this as well. So there are some people who do convert to common law. And we have another phase of Employment Connect, which is at the end of a stat claim life cycle where we provide additional support for those who haven't returned to work. So just to give you some context. The other difference probably from WorkCover Queensland perspective is that we are an in-house case management model. We don't outsource to agents. We do it all ourselves. So it gives us a lot of element of control and understanding to work collectively as a group with our 350 odd case managers who manage this portfolio across the life of their claims. Now, I thought I'd quickly run through some of what we learned in the time frame. So I'm not going to go through everything here, but what I can tell you is that there's sort of 4 stages you want to think about when we ran this project and some of the preparation and planning and what we learned from that. Planning and prior to go live is absolutely critical. So you do really need to understand the impacts of the change you're going to make and what it means to all users. So it's not just the case managers who get impacted here. There can be the people at the front end who are making decisions on claim liability. It can also be your call centre. So there are other aspects of this you need to consider when making your planning stages, so involving as many people who can be involved at one time. The other key piece here that we learned from our project was you must involve the frontline leaders early. You have to have them on board and understanding the why and the how, and they can be your biggest champions. And you need to give them time to adapt to something that is new. From a training and communications perspective, you need to make sure that you address different learning styles. People have different ways of learning. Some are visual, some like face-to-face, some like online, some like video, some like observations. So you need to provide an output for different ways of learning. And the other aspect is that it's also the same for your customers who are involved in here. So customers need to understand that whether they're a large business who are quite systemized and understand some of this more high risk stuff versus a small business who doesn't have a lot of experience here and is more about what's in it for me and how can it help my business. So adjusting your style and your preparation and communication with those customer groups is vital as well. When you go live, it's not sit and forget. That's probably the key message I would go to it. You can't just move on to the next thing. This takes time to embed, and you need to give yourself time to embed, check in, review, assess the progress, adjust, adapt. It's critical to make sure it's embedded and continues to be embedded. So don't expect that over a couple of weeks you're going to have this embedded. You need to look at 6 to 12 months to continue to work through and keep evolving as you go. Remembering you're going to have new people to join the business in that time. You have to bring them up to speed in this space as well. From an outcome perspective, I'd like to say it's solved the world's problems, but I'll be honest, it hasn't. But what it has done is given us a really accurate way of identifying risk, and we can address that risk by knowing about it up front. Our next evolution here is really trying to establish those recommendations and the implementation of that to actually change the trajectory of those claims and involving the various stakeholders to influence that. So it's a work in progress, but it's something we're very proud of and has set the platform for future success. Just to get onto the case managers in terms of their role here, I think it goes without saying that the job of a case manager is critical to achieving successful outcomes for employers and workers. You need to remember that they are all about enabling meaningful change through influence and intervention. And it's a challenging role. So being able to communicate with different parties, being able to engage, promote, influence, sometimes counsel, sometimes support, manage themselves, manage each other. So the importance of case managers can't be underestimated. They work within a very complex ecosystem, as you can see up there, and at many times they've got different parties coming from different directions, trying to influence potentially different outcomes. So being able to deliver this is critical to supporting case managers. Having the right information, the right tools will certainly mean that they can deliver better outcomes. Now, I think we might bring Ross back in.
Thanks very much, Matt, for that fly through of what Recovery Blueprint is and what was required. We both know that it was a very quick summary of several years of our lives. I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, so coming into Recovery Blueprint, we're looking to change, introduce quite a number of processes to the customer representatives and the customer advisors or the case managers. when introducing that, was there something that you thought, oh, we're going to spend a lot of time on this particular factor? Maybe it was that, something technical, and you thought, okay, we're going to be spending a lot of time doing this, but in fact, you actually spent your time elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a good question, Ross. I think, and while I wasn't directly involved in the immediate pilot teams, but also the flow onto the rest of the business, one of the things we thought we'd be doing a lot of was obviously on the how. So the technical stuff, how's it work in the system, all the screens and all the various functions. And yes, we did have to do that, but in reality, it was more about the why. So why are we doing this? How does it fit with our case management approach? What's different about it? How does it help me do what it is? So it's a lot of that was about the engaging with our people and leaders to bring them on that journey. And that's where we spent a lot more time. And as I alluded to in the presentation, it's where your return on investment is by spending a lot of time with the people who are actually delivering this at the front line. The technology is great and designing it to suit it is good. And they get used to the how, but you still want to keep reminding them of the why and what's in it for them and how it actually helps them do their job better. And the big picture is important to sell with them, I think, especially if it's something different. That means they have to do something different to what they've always done. So if you can set the journey for what it means for them and how in the future that's going to help inform a better outcome, I think that's critical.
Right, and sort of talking about that how and the why from a research perspective, we set up the phases of the pilot quite specifically. But what I learned from a research perspective is how we wanted the case managers to think about particular parts of the process. Let's take using the questionnaires, for example. Took longer than expected, but they got to where we wanted to be. So to start off with, they were very focused on, what do I need to do? And in that phase, they kind of got a hold of that. But then later down the track, they would then sort of see the why and the usefulness of that particular component. It just happened quite a bit later. So for me, that was the key learning, was that it actually takes longer than you think it will. What are the challenges for a business with allowing something like that to mature?
And I think with any project, you're trying to deliver something quickly and successfully and efficiently, but in reality, what we're trying to do here is change people's behaviour and bring them along for a journey. So again, I think allowing people time to accept a new process and work through the why, but also in a larger business like ourselves, we use 7 pilot teams and we had to run that alongside what is the normal business operation. We don't just suddenly flip the switch and move everyone across. So allowing us to do it in staged approach, give us an opportunity to understand how each of those stages is working, adapt, adjust, correct, and be prepared for the next phase. And each phase allowed us to then further assess how it went, what we learned from that, and how we then might, with a future view, to bring it across to the whole business. And the staged approach is critical. You can't just flip 300 customer advisors into suddenly new. You've got to think about your existing customers and portfolio, how you transition that through, how you bring your customers along for that journey, particularly employers when it's something new. They may be used to having every single claim actively managed to the nth degree. In reality of it is the risk profiles don't reflect the need to do that. So a stage approach allowed us to then adjust also for business peaks. So we had, you have high volume periods of the year when you don't want to stage a new process. You've got premium renewal season, lots of other things go on. And then by allowing us that stage of process, mean we could adapt, adjust, but also slot it in where the business really needed it.
Okay, and so I've done a little bit of research in this area, and we part of that research has actually asked a number of different insurance companies. What have they done around trying to introduce? It's the holy grail sometimes in terms of that risk identification and early intervention. So it's been tried lots, and what we found as part of that is that lots of places found it really difficult to upscale from a pilot to something that can actually be applied across the business for a range of reasons. What do you think are the critical factors behind the success of actually taking Recovery Blueprint from that 7 pilot teams to the business more widely?
First of all, senior leadership sponsorship endorsement is critical, so the business has endorsed it and actually commits to doing it. Because once you start it, you're pretty much into it and you're looking to move through it. So I think that's important, that you've got critical buy-in from your executive and your senior leadership teams, and they're part of the journey in the case of this. Research for us was a new thing. It wasn't something we'd done in the past, and certainly not in this space in terms of what would change our claims management model. So I think that's important to have executive buy-in. The other aspects will be you have to be prepared to make an evolutionary shift. I think you have to understand you're going to do something different here. And as I alluded to, we haven't nailed this yet and we're still trying to nail it. But I think if you make that conscious decision to move away from something and support it and continue to support it, that's going to help you embed that over time. And I definitely think that taking a staged approach was a great opportunity to allow us to make sure the business picked it up bit by bit. And for us, we have different customers. So we have large customers and small customers, I alluded to. So rolling this to a small business portfolio that we have is very different to rolling to a big end-of-town customer group who have lots of systems. And you have to be prepared to adjust the style. So timing it amongst those customer groups was what we end up doing to allow it to make sure we could adjust as we went along. So I think a couple of those things is probably where you'd be looking at.
And we were talking a little bit before we came on air today, and you were saying that that there was perhaps on the ground a little bit of curiosity in terms of those 7 teams that had a different system. There was a bit of what are they doing? I hope when do we get to do that? To what extent is that almost that positivity or an eagerness amongst the case managers contribute to that timing of expansion, I suppose, or rollout?
Yeah, we were talking about it before. It's an interesting one that there was a little bit of that. What are they doing over there? That looks interesting. Can we have a bit of that? Is it? So there was that excitement of something new, what it would mean. The challenge is timing that right and making sure that messaging around that supports it. So it's not to scare people. It's to actually assist and work with their role and improve the way they do things, but not necessarily to add more work. The idea is to try and have the messaging right. But that natural sense of curiosity and a little bit of competitive that sounds pretty good. I'd like to do that. And how's that helping? So you can use that to your advantage to actually bring the whole organisation along for the journey, and not just your claims teams, but the rest of the business is important too, so they know what's happening. I think we use that to our advantage to just bring people in bit by bit. And when they saw a flight plan of when they were coming in, they knew what was coming, they got prepared, and we were able to launch that with them.
Great. I had a question in my head, but it's disappeared. So I guess the question is, what's next for WorkCover Queensland and Recovery Blueprint?
Look, I think I alluded to in the presentation, the bit that we still need to work on is those recommendations of care, the stepped care approach. So what are the established, well-known interventions that you might use, whether that be case conferencing, adjustment to injury counselling, versus more new interventions that we might test, and how we embed that into the system and our people to go, when you see this, there are some things you should try, and here's the way to do it. So that's certainly one thing we'll look at. We're also going to have a look at that group of claims that fall into the monitored bucket down below, just at how that's working for us and where there's opportunities to improve that process. We're also going to have a look at the model itself. So we're going to have a look as how is it still working, and how can we utilise that further to even produce more information to our people to say, this one, even though you've done all the relative risk profiles, something's not quite right here. So how do we systemise some of that changing risk across the course of the claim? And probably what I didn't allude to is that we made a conscious decision that when we overread and put into a higher category or risk category, we didn't reduce it down. We left it in the higher risk category. So this would be another layer of using that existing data to go, can we even further refine the risk and improve that outcome by targeting groups that may have gone a little bit further off track as it would be, and can we produce information? So it'll be about further evolving the model as best as we can. But again, it's all about embedding with our people still.
One thing from the research perspective, as part of the design of Recovery Blueprint, Monash came in and we watched how the case managers actually operated and how they went about their role. And one of the things that stood out for us was that there needed to be flexibility within the system. Otherwise, the case managers would find it difficult, or they would just work around the system, if you like. What are some of the, from your perspective, what are some of the positives in the mind and negatives of a system that has flexibility built in?
Yeah, it's a very good point. You want your case managers to have a level of autonomy and authority to go and do what they need to do within the course of the claim, obviously within the legislation and all the usual provisions and business processes. But you also want to allow them a bit of flexibility. What flexibility does do is it means they may opt out of certain things or opt into certain things depending on where they go. So that ability to find that balance of making it mandatory or making it optional, and that's the challenge of bringing everyone along for that journey. So an example of that is the use of the injury questionnaires has been a focus to raise that up. Gradually over time with more work, you see that increase because they're so successful when they go out that about 70% of workers return them. So it's beneficial. And we've used those questionnaires later to actually show how it helps the outcome. So if you can bring them along for the why with the flexibility, I think that helps them see the benefits over time. But you've got to find the balance because human nature is to find something else or another way. And the other thing is to do is be aware of anything else that's going into their case management system right then, new changes and bits and pieces which may add to or detract from that. It's always a balance of finding that administration demand and actually doing the real proactive case management. So if you get that right, you'll be doing really well.
Now, I've got about 10 other questions that I could ask you now, but what we are going to do, there'll be a slight pause, but we'll be able to come back with some questions from the audience.
Thanks, everybody, and welcome back to the QA session for this seminar. A reminder, if you do have any questions, just press the Ask a Question box, but we'll get started with a couple of questions that are a bit similar, so I'll ask them kind of simultaneously. What were the key outcomes that WorkCover Queensland was hoping to achieve, and what outcomes were achieved, or were those outcomes achieved?
That's a very good question, and it was probably aligned to each of the phases of the project in the end. So being able to, first of all, embed a new process for case management that aligned to best practice and using the evidence base, so identifying risk. So from that perspective, I think we've been able to embed that into the system and deliver on that. So that was one of our key objectives. Two was to obviously bring in the use of targeted questionnaires and tools and profiles and checklists to further assist identifying of risk and how to manage it. That was successful in terms of being able to do that. The bit where it wasn't successful was probably the third phase in terms of those care recommendations. So while we had that embedded, it is still a work in progress, I alluded to. So getting people to undertake and utilise some of those care recommendations, which some of it comes from a lack of confidence too in being able to, there's a capability aspect at some levels, but there's a confidence being able to have those challenging or productive conversations with providers and employers and manage some of those dynamics. So that's certainly an area of opportunity for us. Overarching of that, our goal was obviously to embed that evidence-based system that identified risks to help us target the right claims at the right time, but allowing that flexibility and tailoring it. And I think we've achieved that. Has it changed our ultimate outcomes of claims costs and durations? No, not yet, but there's been many other factors that have come through in the last couple of years that have probably impacted that. But it's certainly something we're continuing on the journey with. So over time, I think we'll get there.
Great, thanks, Matt. One of the other questions we had was, what were the main differences between this program and the previous claims management model? What was there beforehand?
The biggest difference is that we weren't using really structured risk assessment. We weren't triaging. Our simple process before that was probably just a short and long duration type approach. And then without any sort of informed, usually on some rudimentary measures around time loss or surgery or time for treatment, and some very simple sort of measures that are more traditional medical model type approach. what we've done is, while we, over a number of years, had brought in biopsychosocial approach generally around that, we hadn't embedded the risk. So that's the biggest difference for us. So this is the first time we've worked away from having everyone treated in a recipe approach, I suppose, at some level, to actually targeted approaches tailored to the risk. That was the biggest difference for us. It didn't change our model in terms of in-house. It didn't change who did the role. It just changed the way we approach the risk, which we probably done inherently, but not scientifically and backed by the research, which is what Ross's team were able to help us produce.
Yeah, well, I guess what we found as a research team coming in was how a case manager might have addressed or might have applied that biopsychosocial approach, or what factors they might have addressed were more highly dependent on who trained them. And the way that WorkCover Queensland worked is that there was a strong buddy system. They worked really well in teams. And so how a team operated was very similar across the team. But it was a reflection of sort of how they trained and how that worked up. And there are lots of good things about that, but it does mean that sometimes some things might be missed if you're not sort of didn't have a structured approach to assess a range of factors. And so I guess what we were aiming to do with Recovery Blueprint was to actually bring that structured approach, bring a consistency to which factors were considered. And then that care delivery recommendation approach is about, well, some consistency to how it's actually how it's addressed. And I mean, ultimately, my view of risk identification is to help your novice case managers to make decisions like your really experienced case managers. Your case managers who pick up on things very quickly in a conversation, whether it be with an employer or the injured worker. It's not those experienced case managers' behaviour that you need to make a big change to. It's actually, how can you bring your novice case managers up to that level as fast as possible, so things don't get missed. And I think that's so when we're talking about the change, it was trying to bring some structure to assessing some of those factors that might have gone under the radar sooner.
I think the other thing, Ross, was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what was interesting that our people could pretty accurately assess the risk without the tools. So they could already see the risk. This just systemised and allowed it to present really easily to them. But inherently, they could see the risk, they understood it. It just gave them that structure around the risk.
And particularly for those those more novice case managers, it gives them that permission, I guess, to actually go, well, maybe I need to think creatively here, or maybe it is okay to put that referral in place, or whatever it might be. It's you don't need them to sort of get years of experience to work out, oh, when that happens, if I don't do something, then this could actually take much longer to help that person to recover. So when they did sense that there was something wrong with someone with difficulty coping, yes, the short form Arebro more often than not came back as high risk, but then there's that underlying data to say, yep, go ahead, do what you need to do to support this person, even if you think it's a little outside what's normal. There's permission, go for it. Or take it to someone within your team to talk through it. Like it's and then also, and I'm sure you've got examples of this, Matt. It gives the case manager something to take to the treatment providers as well, to say, we've got this information to suggest that perhaps we need to take a different approach or do something different.
Yeah, it's true, Ross. The injury questionnaires are quite powerful. We had a couple of examples where I give two examples in particular I know of, where someone was on a waiting list to see a treating specialist, and by use of the injury questionnaire going across to that treating specialist, they, with the high risks that were sitting in a specialist, expedited the referral in to see them earlier. We had the reverse of that someone who was relatively young being booked for spinal surgery, but in the end, the risk was quite low based on the injury questionnaires, and the surgeon changed tact and didn't do the surgery. Now, they're very specific, but you can see the power of the questionnaires. Providers are using them, right? So it's just supports some of the information, and connecting the dots from what they're seeing or not seeing, as it may be, is a useful tool. So, the questionnaires can be quite valuable.
We had a couple of questions actually about the questionnaires that you use, and I heard the short form Arebro there. Were there other ones that were used in the program?
You want to take that one, Ross?
Sure. So we used the short form Arebro questionnaire to assess if there was the risk that someone was having difficulty coping with their injury, or if they had recovery expectations that didn't quite match what was happening. We used injury questionnaires or patient-reported outcome measures like the Oswestry Disability Index, if someone had back pain. And we had, the aim of that questionnaire is it gives you an idea of the functional limitation the person's having as a result of their injury. So we had one of those for back pain, neck pain, upper limb conditions and lower limb conditions. And the idea was to be able to give the case manager an idea of how, I guess, what's the severity of the limitation that the person is having as a response of to their injury. And we put in place some markers for the case manager to say, well, this is a high score and this is a low score. They were the key questionnaires that we used. We also had one that was around about some social supports as well. So it's important to, I guess, point out here that the use of the questionnaires, it wasn't, the key is not the questionnaire itself in terms of which question you're asking. It's actually about how do you embed it into the process so it's actually providing useful information. So the case managers know what to do with it so that the injured worker themselves knows why they're filling it out and how it's beneficial. And as Matt alluded to before, we've got a really positive response from injured workers. It comes back, and on average, 70% or higher of the time when you send a questionnaire out. So it's about embedding that into the process so everyone understands what it's for and how it can be used and what it indicates. And it can be quite powerful when used correctly, whether it's the short form of Rebro or some other measure of someone having difficulty coping is neither here nor there. It's about working out what's a process that fits within the operations, how case managers are going to use it, that's going to be acceptable to the injured worker as well. And then what do you do with it when it does come back?
Fantastic. Thanks, Bryce. We're just about to run out of time for our Q&A session here. But if you do have any other questions, you're welcome to leave them there. I'm sure Ross or Matthew can get around to getting back to you with an answer. But we'll be back in a moment just for the closing note of the session. Thank you for attending the third Compare Project event in the 2022 Healthy Working Lives seminar series. We will be hosting another 3 free events between now and June. You can register for them on this platform. The next event will be Thursday, 5th of May between 12:30 and 1:15 Australian Eastern Standard Time. Professor Alex Colley and Dr. Mary Wyatt, occupational physician, we'll be talking about new insights into healthcare use in Australian workers' compensation schemes, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you very much.